Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of Close Reading COVID-19. My name is Emily Wright. I'm a high school English teacher in Southern California, and when I'm not teaching, I work part-time as a research assistant for Dr. Craig Wright, who also happens to be my dad. Dr. Wright is board certified in internal medicine and infectious disease and has over 40 years of clinical and research experience in infectious disease. He holds 15 patents and is a graduate of the College of Arts and Sciences and the medical school at the University of Virginia. He completed his internship at Columbia Presbyterian Harlem Hospital in New York and his residency in internal medicine and infectious disease and tropical medicine training at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C., where he set up the first AIDS clinic in the Army. He went on to found two public biopharmaceutical companies, Univax Biologics and Novavax. The focus of his research is vaccines, adjuvants for vaccines, and delivery vehicles for drugs and vaccines. He currently runs a private medical practice, infusion center, and research lab on the Monterey Peninsula in California. Good morning, Dr. Wright.
Good morning, Emily.
So before we get into our topic for today, I thought we could tell our audience a little bit about why we wanted to start this program. So you and I have been following the research on COVID-19 since the beginning of the pandemic, and you've been advising your patients on how to stay safe and kind of helping them interpret a lot of the medical research and what it means for them personally. And one of the things I've noticed in all the reading I've done is that there's so much information being put out about the virus on a daily basis, and some of it is conflicting, even when it comes from trusted news publications and peer-reviewed medical journals.
Yes, Emily. Well, that's the reality. We're learning about a novel virus. The information we have changes very quickly because of mutations.
Right. And I also noticed that sometimes I'll read a news report and it references a medical study, and then I'll get one impression from the news report, but then I'll go back and read the study itself and I'll get a slightly different impression. And I think that's part of why we wanted to create this program, is to take folks through a close reading of the medical research so they could be more in touch with primary sources rather than just secondary ones.
That's right, Emily. We want to take an in-depth look at infectious diseases, not just 3-minute sound bites we've all gotten accustomed to hearing on the news. We want to give folks some tools so they know what to look for when they read the medical research.
Excellent. And one tool we're going to focus on today is vocabulary. So our episode today focuses on close reading B.1.1.7, which is the one of the newer variants of SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19. And so we wanted to talk about a couple key terms that we're going to be using throughout the podcast, just to help our audience understand a little bit more of what we want to accomplish here. So the first one is actually not a medical term, it's an education term, and that is close reading. The title of this program is Close Reading COVID-19, and we want our audience to understand what we mean by close reading. So literacy expert Timothy Shanahan defines close reading as, quote, an intensive analysis of a text in order to come to terms with what it says, how it says it, and what it means. And so close reading really involves focusing in on specific passages, annotating, looking for patterns, asking questions, and connecting a text to what we already know. So that's what we'll be trying to do with the research articles that we present to you on this program. The other key term that we are going to talk about a lot is, of course, SARS-CoV-2, and that's short for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. This is the name of the virus that causes COVID-19, and this is the term that you'll often see in the medical literature when researchers are discussing COVID-19. They will not say COVID-19, they'll often say SARS-CoV-2. All right, we want to introduce to you the study that we'd like to spotlight today. This is from a group called the New and Emerging Respiratory Virus Threats Advisory Group, or nerve tag. They're based in the United Kingdom. And because B.1.1.7 was first identified in the United Kingdom, we want to look at some of the research that's going on in the UK right now. This report was published on February 11th, and we're hopeful that will be another update on this report soon. But for now, we're going to work with what we have here. And we've used a program called CAMI so that we could annotate this article to point out a few things. So the first thing I see here is in the summary. The first item in the summary of this article says, on Thursday, 21st January, NerveTag presented evidence to SAGE of increased disease severity in people infected with variant of concern VOC B.1.1.7 compared to people infected with non-VOC variants. So I want to backtrack a little bit, Dr. Wright, and I'm wondering if you can just first kind of talk to us about what is a variant. When people say variant, what do they mean by that?
Well, a variant is a series of mutations and or deletions of the amino acid sequence of viral proteins. Mutations are when the nucleic acid sequence changes, and that sometimes results in what's called a point mutation, which can change the amino acid in a protein. There are 21 amino acids that make up all peptides and proteins in nature, to include every plant, every animal, every virus, every bacterium, and every parasite. The spike protein is the protein on the surface that binds, of the virus, that binds to the ACE2 receptor on human cells. All of the vaccines for COVID-19 are currently available, target the spike protein sequence. First, 2019. Sometimes we call that the COVID-19 classic strain. The spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 has 1,273 of these amino acids. The virus doesn't need to be passed from one person to another for mutations to occur. In other words, mutations can occur in a single patient. A deletion is when the virus fails to make one or more amino acids in the sequence. If a mutation or deletion is a selective advantage for the virus, then the mutation will persist and proliferate. And whether or not a mutation or mutations and deletions have an effect on infectivity or mortality depends upon how we follow our patients and compare those patients to patients that were previously infected with other strains.
Okay, I see. So there's a lot of focus on the spike protein because that information about the virus was used to create the vaccines, right? So if we see changes in the spike protein, that could that maybe mean that the vaccines will be less effective?
Yes, it could, particularly if the mutations occur in the receptor binding domain of the virus.
Okay.
And those mutations would interfere or improve or could increase or decrease binding of the virus. If it increases binding, that would be a selective advantage and might have an effect on both infectivity and lethality. Now,
Okay. So if we look at just the genetic makeup of B.1.1.7, this variant that is now very common in the United Kingdom and has also made its way to the United States, can you take us through, can you talk to us about the two mutations that make this a variant of concern and what their effect is?
yes, many of the mutations in Europe after the virus migrated from China, developed a glycine mutation at amino acid 614. In other words, you substitute the glycine for another amino acid. And that, the way that's always written is D614G. The amino acid that's changed is listed first. The number of the amino acid in the spike protein is next listed. And then the substituting amino acid, in this case, a G, a glycine.
Mm.
So that one amino acid change increased the amount of spike protein on the virus fivefold. And that caused a significant problem in the isolates in the first outbreak in Europe. Now, the B.1.1.7 has some additional mutations in the spike protein. Now, there are three basic areas of the spike protein. There's a S1 sequence, which contains the receptor binding domain, and then the S2 sequence. There are mutations or deletions in the three areas. The most important one, besides the D614G mutation, is the N501Y mutation. And that's in the receptor binding motif in a peptide that helps anchor the loop sequence of the virus to the ACE2 receptor. And the N is an asparagine at position 501 that was substituted with a tyrosine, making the sequence more hydrophobic and therefore better able to bind. So it's a way of thinking of the mutation allows the peptide sequence to help lock in the loop sequence to the ACE2 receptor. And that in turn has made the virus more infectious. And as we'll show you a little later, it increases the number of hospitalizations and the number of deaths in the UK.
Okay, well, that's a nice segue. So, well, one thing we can see is here's what happened with the cumulative cases in the UK, right? So, you can see back in March, it's a lot less, and then they have their summer spike, and then if I'm correct, wasn't it sometime in November when they first identified the B.1.1.7 isolate?
Yeah, they actually had some early isolations in September or October,
I
but
see.
things really took off in the November to February timeframe.
Right. And so now they're up to, over 4 million infections,
Yeah,
whereas
they
all
actually
summer
have,
they were under 1 million.
yeah, they have 4 million as of yesterday,
Got it.
4,126,150 infections.
Right. Okay.
And
So let's take a look here and see what else this paper can teach us about B.1.1.7 here. So one of the interesting things to me was that at the end of the paper, they have this great appendix with a table down here. We'll go back and look at their recommendations in a couple minutes. But so in this annex here, so this is kind of, they looked at data that from preprints, right? So from papers that have not yet been published in peer-reviewed journals, but this data was provided to the nerve tag group ahead of time so that they could kind of look more holistically at what's going on, right? Do I have that right?
That's correct. And in fact, many of these studies aren't complete, so they're preliminary data sets that were submitted for evaluation.
Okay, so we should approach with caution because it's not official peer-reviewed research, but we can still kind of look at some patterns here and see what's going on. So I see that so this is data from 23 different studies, right, at various hospitals and institutions around the UK. Um,
Yes.
what do they mean when they're talking about like estimate of effect? What do these numbers here mean?
Well, if Emily, if the number is 1, then that essentially means that there's no difference between the two groups. Okay.
So no
So,
difference between how B.1.1.7 is affecting patients versus how, say, the original Wuhan isolate or other isolates were affecting patients.
right. And then the other thing they do is they list the 95% confidence interval. And so that's the range. And the estimated effect, it falls within that range, which is 1.36. Now, what that means in this particular evaluation was looking at fatality, and we don't have the whole studies to look at yet, but what it suggests that is that there's an increased instance of fatality. 1.1.7 isolate is the cause of the infection.
I
And
see. Okay. So we counted when we looked here, we found that 18 of these studies found the estimate of effect to be more than 1, meaning that uh, B.1.1.7 would be more fatal, right,
that's correct. Or it
than the
causes an
other.
increase, yeah, it causes an increased death rate or fatality rate.
Right. And we do see there are a couple where the number is lower than 1. I think there were 4 where the number was 1 or lower. Also, a couple of these were looking at not at deaths, but at hospitalizations. So it looks like there were 4 or 5 where the number was lower than 1, but that the other 18, the estimate of effect was uh, higher, right?
Yeah, yes, and Emily, many of these were different data sets and some from different areas of the country.
Right, that's important to keep in mind. Okay,
So
so
until we get the actual preprints of these studies in the final analyses, we won't really be able to compare each one of these studies. Uh, but the data is highly suggestive that there's an increase infectivity and mortality with B.1.1.7
okay,
isolates.
and that's what they conclude, right? Is if we look at their conclusion here in number 24, they say there's evidence from analysis of multiple different data sets that infection with VOC variant of concern B.1.1.7 is associated with an increased risk of hospitalization and death compared to infection with non-VOC viruses. They do acknowledge the limitations as we discussed. So then my next question would be like, what did what did this knowledge, what are their recommendations here, and then I'm wondering also like what did the UK actually do to respond to this variant of concern?
Sure. I think you've highlighted it under recommendation 27. They don't feel there's been adequate detailed documentation of nursing home cases and deaths, and they feel this needs to be done moving forward. And that could be said also of the United States. We've had a horrific problem in our extended care nursing home facilities and a very high a fatality rate in those institutions.
I see. Okay, so what I'm wondering is, so this was their recommendation, detailed documentation of nursing home cases and deaths as needed. I'm wondering, I see here that they were able to, in the UK, get their infection rate, or their positivity rate to come down a little bit over the course of the month of January. What were some of the non-pharmaceutical interventions that they put in place to help make this happen?
Well, they uh, did universal masking for one. they closed all non-essential businesses to include pubs and restaurants. They also closed schools. And it wasn't just the number of infections that changed, the hospitalizations have decreased, but they haven't gotten back to the October numbers yet. So even though they've been in lockdown now since January 4th, they still don't have the infection under control, nor the number of hospitalizations back to where they were in October.
I see. And that would really be the goal, right? Is to get back
That's
to here,
correct.
in order to have some kind of sense of normalcy and not overwhelm hospital emergency rooms and so on. Okay, interesting. So another thing that we wanted to spotlight, because we thought it was interesting that they did close all the school buildings in the UK at the beginning of January. Is we were kind of curious about in infections in children, right? And whether that had kind of motivated that. So we were able to pull some data. The United Kingdom has an open data portal, and anyone can go and pull data about COVID-19 infections, hospitalizations, deaths, and so on. So we were able to pull this data, and they actually have the data divided by age group. They look at age groups 0 to 5 and 6 to 17 and so on. So we were able to pull COVID-19 hospitalization data for these two age groups, and we looked at 4 different 1 month ranges. So Dr. Wright, can you just talk a little bit about what you noticed in the data here?
Well, the most interesting thing to me was that when this B.1.1.7 infection took off, the number of children, either from 0 to 5 of years of age or 6 to 17, markedly increased. And so you can see it particularly between 12/4/20 and 1/4/21. You have to realize these are hospitalizations per day of children.
Okay, so
So
these
they
were
they
new
went
new hospitalizations over the course of that month, and then we calculated approximate number of new hospitalizations per day.
per
So, for
day.
example, in the month of December, you see about 15 new hospitalizations per day in each of these age groups, whereas earlier in the pandemic, like in November and even way back in March, you only saw between 8 and 10 hospitalizations per day in each age group.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
And so the introduction of this mutant B.1.1.7 had a significant impact in the total number of hospitalizations of children in both age groups, and of course, then the number of hospitalizations per day. We don't have fourth, but uh, the schools are still closed right this minute. But when they open schools, unless these numbers drop significantly, one would anticipate they will have more children infected.
Right. Now, I know that they closed school buildings on January 4th, and I noticed that the numbers went up even after that. Is that kind of probably attributed to a delay I mean, certainly you wouldn't argue that closing school buildings caused these numbers of hospitalizations to go up, right?
No, I think there's just been massive transmission in UK during this period, and it persists despite the fact that they had closed the schools and they'd gone to a lockdown. Remember, it can take 5 to 12 days before someone becomes symptomatic.
Right. So the momentum of the infections had already kind of picked up, and so at this point, while I'm sure it did help to lock things down, you're already going to have an increase in hospitalizations in young people here.
Yes.
Okay. So there was another issue that we've been aware of with young people, which is this inflammatory syndrome that some children develop after being infected with COVID-19. And the Guardian uh, published an article about this on, I think it was February 5th. And so we looked at this and kind of marked this up. We would have pulled a study about this, except that most of the research that is mentioned in this article hasn't yet been published. And so thus we decided to consult this, because they did interview a couple of the scientists who are really studying the data on this inflammatory syndrome in children. So my understanding is in most parts of the world they call this pediatric inflammatory multisystem syndrome, but in the US we call it MIS-C, which is, are those the same thing?
Yes, they are, Emily.
Okay.
The syndromes are exactly the same.
Okay.
And
So when people are researching, they can search PIMS, they can also search capital MIS dash C, and that will get you articles about this syndrome. Okay,
that's
so
correct.
what were the key things that stood out to you about this article?
Well, one of the things, just the number of children that had this, but the other thing is that these syndromes are worse in children uh, who are either Black, Asian, or ethnic minorities, what they call in England BAME, BAME.
Right. Okay. So it's
And
more common in children of color. And the figure that they give us here is that 75% of the children who are worst affected by PIMS were children of color. Also, I see it says 4 out of 5 of them were previously healthy, which I feel like runs counter to a lot of the narratives that we hear about COVID-19, that it disproportionately affects people with no pre-existing health or who have pre-existing health conditions rather. So I was surprised to read that 4 out of 5 children who were afflicted with this syndrome had been previously healthy. So it's not like kids with diabetes or kids with obesity or things like that that would put them at an increased risk. That was very surprising to me.
yeah,
Um,
that is surprising.
yeah. Okay. So and is this a syndrome that you have to have a symptomatic COVID-19 infection to develop this?
No, you do not.
Okay. So
But
some
but
for some kids
but
this just comes out of the blue. Maybe they don't even know that they were infected, and then
that's
they
correct.
develop this inflammatory syndrome. As
That's
a,
right. You
if I were a parent, that would really scare me. You know, that prospect that maybe my child had been asymptomatically infected, and then you never know when this might crop up.
and
Um,
and one of the things you have to you worry about is some of the symptoms that these children have when they do get sick mimic all sorts of other conditions. So this could be missed unless physicians are really alert to this and parents are alert to the symptoms.
okay. And how is this generally treated? Do they give them steroids, or what do they do
Yeah,
for
they
this?
they give them uh, steroids. They give them intravenous immune globulin.
Okay.
They have to give them supportive therapy sometimes because their blood pressures have dropped. They can have end organ damage, and these kids can be severely ill, and there are deaths associated with this syndrome. And I want to just point out the data we presented on hospitalizations did not include these children. These
Right,
are
because those were
children.
COVID-19 infection hospitalization.
That's right. Those children were infected, were hospitalized because they had an active symptomatic COVID-19 infection. These children This syndrome can occur is a month after the infection, so or an asymptomatic infection even. So
Okay.
that's this is a different subset of children.
Okay, so this is data that, to my knowledge, this data on PIMS, I don't know that this is even available for folks who like going and looking into data portals and pulling their own data and doing analysis like we do. This data might not even be available yet to folks who want to work with it, but we're hoping that some of the researchers who are mentioned in this article will publish their research soon. I know the article mentioned something about, some of the researchers gave a presentation to a large conference of pediatricians to get out the word about this in the UK. So they said 1 in 5,000 children will get this. If that's their estimate. I'm not sure how they calculate that. And Dr. Wright, you went over some of the really serious possible symptoms of this. And so it looked like they had a pretty marked increase in hospitalizations with young people, admitting 100 young people a week during this second wave in this past winter, compared to about 30 a week last April. If you were a hospital administrator, would you be concerned about these numbers?
Or a physician, because to increase the number of children infected in your hospital by 70 a week is disconcerting.
Right. So that's gonna probably fill up a PICU, right? Um, okay, and so they estimated between 12 and 15 children every day. Dr. Hermione Lyle is working on this at Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust in London. I think she's the one who gave this presentation to the large group of pediatricians. And again, she's noticing that children of color were disproportionately affected by this. So 47% of the patients who ended up in pediatric intensive care were of Afro-Caribbean origin, 28% Asian background, and that's between 5 and 6 times higher than the 14% of the UK's population that children of color make up. So it's definitely following that trend that we've seen throughout the pandemic of people of color disproportionately affected by this virus. And then they also spoke with Liz Whitaker, who's the PIMS spokesperson for the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health. And I think there's some more comments from her down below. Let's see. What else was notable here? Oh, they said 78% of patients had no underlying illnesses. So that really reinforces what we were talking about earlier. It looks like more boys are afflicted than girls, which I don't know why that's happening. I don't know if you have any hypotheses about that, or if they're just catching it more in boys. But then they said almost 1 in 4 of those who end up in a PICU develop a heart condition called coronary artery dilation, which is potentially fatal. Do you feel? What would be your conclusions about that?
Well, I think it's disconcerting that this virus, and we've known this virus for a while, has an effect on the heart. It's not just in children, but in adults as well. And the long-term complications in children that particularly have these heart conditions, everything from coronary dilation to myocarditis, the long-term effects of this virus on the myocardium, we won't know for several years, but I don't think it's going to be good.
Okay, so this is definitely not something you want to get. This is not something you want your child to get. So one of the people they interviewed for the article, Dr. Whitaker, had said that parents should not be alarmed by the surge in hospitalizations because the recent incidence of PIMS is proportionate to the pandemic's greater impact on adults over recent weeks. Is she basically saying that this is just to be expected because you have more virus circulating in the community, and if you have more adults getting sick, more kids are going to get sick?
Well, the answer is if you have more adults sick, you're going to have more children sick. Early in the pandemic, particularly in our country, they made statements that children wouldn't get sick, wouldn't have complications, problems from COVID-19. In fact, they said that many children would just have asymptomatic infections, would be fine. It's just a minor case of influenza-like illness. And that's not true. And it's to what's happening in children. Now, in our country, we don't have this type of data set because we don't have cradle to grave care. And we aren't even collecting the data on children between the ages of 1 and 5 and 6 and 17 or 6 and 19.
Right, right,
And nor the hospitalization rates. Now,
right.
there is some reporting that I think we're going to go into in a minute, but
Right. Yeah. So in our home state of California, this is the only data that we were able to collect on children. The state of California makes available in their open data portal. First of all, they just divide the age group as 0 to 17. So we don't have data on older children versus younger children. We just have this one monolithic age group of 0 to 17 to teach us about what's going on with COVID-19 in children. They do provide, so they provide cumulative case data, and they provide death data, and they provide new daily case data. So this is just a graph that we created of the cumulative positive infections in the age group 0 to 17 from April 2nd, which is when they really started, collecting and providing the data to the public, up until February 7th. And I actually tried to get an update on this data yesterday, but the data portal is down. So hopefully they'll have that up and running again soon so we can get some updated data on cases in children. But this is what we were able to notice, is that from Thanksgiving, so from November 27th to February 7th, we had 297,614 new cases in children ages 0 to 17 in California. And you can see this this slope really picks up after the Thanksgiving holiday, right?
yeah, it certainly does. And to put that in perspective, Emily, the total number of cases in California, adults and children, is 3,517,576 as of the 21st.
So people are looking at that 3 million number, and then they're looking at 400 some thousand, and they're saying cases in children are rare, right? But when, because they're looking at percentages, right? They're looking at this as a percentage of the whole. But, when you look at the raw data, I mean, I really wouldn't say, I wouldn't look at a big number like, 427,000 and say, oh, it's rare. That doesn't seem rare to me, but I guess it's, there's a degree of subjectivity to interpreting the data there. So another thing we wanted to look at is, we were curious what's going on with PIMS, or MIS-C, as we call them in the United States, in our country. And so the CDC is actually does publish data on this on their website. So Dr. Wright, can you tell us a little bit about what we learned from the CDC data on this inflammatory syndrome in children in the US?
Yeah, the disturbing thing to me was I did not know how many cases of MIS-C had been reporting. And I said, you have to remember, we have totally incomplete reporting. This is
Mhm.
volunteer reporting. And we do not have reporting from every state, and certainly not from every county in every state.
Right. And well, they're also very careful to say this is the cases that meet the case definition, which probably with a new disease, it's hard for doctors to learn the case definition and how to identify it. The case definition is probably going to change over time, right?
Well, and also it can be confused with other illnesses.
Totally.
So you have to have a high index of suspicion.
Okay.
And the 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 children that actually have this, you would anticipate if they had good antibody tests, that you could identify they had had a prior infection with COVID-19.
Got it.
However, using their definition, they say, and they're behind in all the reporting, obviously, but up to this data point, they say there's been 2,060 MIS-C cases in the United States, and I was surprised there are 30 deaths. I
Yeah.
hadn't realized how many deaths there are. While we've been following this pretty closely, we would occasionally see a report from some state that there had been a death from MIS-C, but I hadn't realized there'd been 30 already reported to the CDC. And
Right.
my
And again, that's for Miss C. That's not, deaths due to pneumonia developed as a complication of COVID-19, right?
That's
Which is
correct.
different.
These are MIS-C deaths, not COVID-19 deaths.
Right, which makes this even messier. Okay, so they give us a map and we can see where you have more cases being identified, and they've divided it. The numbers they've laid out is anything in this dark blue is 51 or more. So it's not clear how many more than 51 you have, right? But 51 is that magic number they've decided to go with. So you can see, the more populous states, California's had more than 51, Texas, Arizona, Florida, um, some of the Great Lakes states and so on, and a bunch of states in New England, Mid-Atlantic as well. North Carolina's had more than 51, Georgia more than 51. So are there any other takeaways for you about this data?
Well, I wish that we would collect more age-specific data, not just on MIS-C, but on COVID-19 infections in general in children. And I think it would be even better to do the break 0 to 5, and then the kids in a grade school, and then the middle school and high school age groups, so that we could actually see where the most infection burden is in our various states, because we have different mutations in different states. In California, we have the Cal-20C variant, which is over half the cases. That's not the case in all these other states. So it's important that every state collect age-specific data, particularly on these unusual syndromes like MIS-C. And I would hope we would change our reporting in this country.
Yeah, it seems like, from an educator's perspective, it seems like that would be, if you had that data breakdown according to the level in school, that would really help school districts inform their policy decisions about, which school buildings they're going to reopen, right? Like if you knew, all we know from this, right, is that most cases were in children and adolescents between the age of 1 and 14. That's not super descriptive, with a median age of 9 years, right? But
That's
it says,
correct.
also tells us that cases have occurred in children and adolescents from less than a year old up to 20 years old. And again, we're seeing the same trend as in the UK, that children of color are disproportionately affected. So they said 69% of reported cases occurred in Latinx kids, and or Black non-Hispanic. So 600 so 690 in Latinx kids and 600 cases in African American kids. And then they also said that 99% of the cases tested positive for SARS-CoV-2. That leads me to wonder, though, um, kids who develop symptoms of MIS-C but had not previously been tested for SARS-CoV-2 for COVID-19, whether those cases would be missed, right? If most of the cases that they're identifying are in kids who have tested positive, I'm wondering how many of those asymptomatic COVID-19 cases are being missed, and then kids are later developing the symptoms, but it's not being identified as a case of MIS-C.
Right. I think, however, Emily, that most of the 99% of cases, I think they're doing antibody testing.
Okay, I see. That would make
Yeah,
more sense.
there, there are a certain number of kids that are PCR positive that have MIS-C, but most of the children would not be PCR positive, but or virus culture positive, but
I see.
would probably be antibody positive, because this syndrome is usually occurs after the active
So they
infection.
wouldn't still be shedding virus a month later. So
That's
the
correct.
PCR would not come back positive.
Most of these children would only be antibody positive. Okay.
Okay. So if parents have concerns that maybe their child is showing symptoms of MIS-C, would it be smart to get an antibody test? Is that something that you
Yes,
would advise?
I would advise people to get an antibody test, but you have to remember that there's so many children out there that are antibody positive because they've had the infection, but they could
Mhm.
have infection with something else that's mimicking MIS-C. So this is a very complex thing that pediatricians and infectious disease specialists that specialize in pediatric infectious disease, and family practitioners that might be seeing children. This is a complex problem for them, and they have to make sure these children aren't septic. Okay.
Mhm.
I
Because
don't
that could
think,
be fatal.
because that could be fatal. And
Mm.
until they know that a child doesn't have a lethal bacterial infection, as an example, they would probably be wise to cover the child till they know that's the case. Most of the most of the hospitals nowadays have some type of antibody test, and they can do PCR assays, but not all places can do that,
So it's a
especially in
good
a
idea for, yeah,
especially in a I work in a rural county, and
right.
while our clinic has these assays, because I'm an infectious specialist in house, most clinics and most pediatricians would not have these, and family practitioners would not have a clinic like ours.
So they need to be referred out to a specialist, and it's quite a complex process. So it's probably a good idea for parents to be vigilant if they have concerns about these symptoms. Definitely consult with their family physician and seek a referral to a specialist if they need it.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. So based on this, I'm kind of curious. A lot of people are probably saying, well, that B.1.1.7, that's in the UK. We don't, it's not so common in the US. So we were kind of wondering, how common is the variant in the US? And we did find that the CDC is tracking that as well as a few other variants, which we won't get into today. We're just going to focus on B.1.1.7. But what does the CDC data on B.1.1.7 tell us and or not tell us?
Well, I think the key thing is we've gone from just having several states reporting infections a month ago to 44 states reporting infections. And this isn't the real number of cases. This is just the number of cases that have been identified. Some specialists feel that by the end of March, the predominant isolate in the United States will be the B.1.1.7 variant. I don't think you can exclude some of the other variants, which we're not going to talk about today,
Mhm.
And one thing they are not tracking is the California variant,
I
which
noticed that it's not on
which we
here.
know is half of the infections in the state of California at the current time.
Right. Yeah, we'll
Half of the new
definitely revisit
infections.
that in a future episode. I think that would add an important piece of this puzzle here. But even in California, we see they've identified 195 instances of B.1.1.7. So we were listening to an interview with one of the U.S. scientists who's been working on isolating this new variant. And didn't he say something like they'd only done like 3 isolations for every every one
No,
1,000 tests or something like that?
well, what he actually said was we've only sequenced
Okay.
three three of every 1,000 virus isolates we have. Now there are countries like New Zealand, which has only had several thousand cases.
Hmm.
They sequence every isolate that they can grow.
Because they can afford to do that because they don't have that many, but we have
Right.
millions and millions of cases, right? And
But
thousands of new cases a day. So you can't possibly sequence them all.
but I
Do
would
you
like to
think
point.
3 per 1,000 is an appropriate number of cases to be
I
sequencing?
think we're ranked. I think we're ranked 40th in the world in
Okay.
testing. But that we may have be improving somewhat. But to give you
Okay.
an example, the United Kingdom has sequenced over 200,000 isolates.
Okay. So they've had around 4 million infections. They've sequenced over 200,000 isolates. We've had many more millions of infections than that, and
And we've
we've
had
sequenced you know under 2,000
well,
instances
I
of
think I
117.
think probably, and I don't have the exact number,
Uh-huh.
but we have 28 million cases in the United States that are PCR positive.
Right.
My guess is we've maybe sequenced no more than 10 to 20,000 isolates so far.
Got it.
And
Got
that number could be lower because we don't have anyone tracking the number.
Okay, so very little accountability because no one's counting really in a holistic way right now. So really hard to know. Okay,
No.
so that would be maybe on our wish list for public health departments and policymakers is to pay a little more
Well,
attention to that.
I've argued that we need to have in the United States, we need to have the ability to isolate the virus and do sequencing in every state, in
Hmm.
every large city and county that has significant numbers of infections.
That makes
And
sense.
we are way behind in doing this. And that's how we could miss the fact that we had a major mutation in the state of California.
Okay, so when epidemiologists go on television and they say, well, B.1.1.7 is still rare, or we're optimistic, or we're not too concerned about this, they don't really have the whole picture because they don't have all the data, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Um,
So based on what we do know, though, what do you think we can expect in the US over the next few months with B.1.1.7 and or other variants?
well, I think with all the variants, to include the California variant,
Uh-huh.
which we've shown that people that have the California variant example uh, can get, who had other infections in the past with some of the original isolates, can get infected with the California variant. So there wasn't any cross protection. And I think that will be the case with most of these variants, particularly the double mutation isolates, like the new UK variant, which has a second mutation, and
Mm.
then the Brazilian and the South African isolates.
So if
So
you're trying to sort of calculate what percentage of the population has herd immunity, you would not factor in people who had a previous COVID-19 infection because of these new variants.
that's correct.
Okay.
Those those patients may be, if they have neutralizing antibodies still, which we don't think lasts more than 6 to 8 months,
Uh-huh.
those patients might be immune to infection from a non-mutant, but particularly these double mutants or the California mutant, which doesn't have these mutations, has different things.
Uh-huh.
I don't think anybody's going to be immune to that.
Got it.
And
Okay.
so the take-home picture for the people making vaccines is that they're all making vaccines against the South African variant right now.
Mm-hmm.
They're making booster vaccines against the South African variant. I would caution that that's the wrong approach.
Okay.
They need to make vaccines against each one of these mutations because they all have different mutations and deletions in the spike protein.
I see.
And they've just picked out one that's the South African variant,
Uh-huh.
which is not spread anywhere near as widely in the United States
Uh-huh.
as the 20 cal C variant and now B.1.1.7. So if
But
you were
they saw
going,
how it affected the efficacy of that. Was it the Johnson and Johnson vaccine? I think that scared a lot of people, right?
well, I think it actually that's another issue about
Uh,
failure of vaccinated people
hmm,
uh, to not get infected. Okay,
right.
and I don't think the data is perfectly clear, and it may be that any of these vaccines give some level of protection, even with all of these unusual mutants.
Let's hope.
But
Yeah.
let's hope, and I think everyone should get vaccinated because of that, Emily, because you can also have back mutations.
Okay.
In other
So where
words,
it reverts back to how it was before, and then you would want
absolutely,
the protection that the vaccine based on the Wuhan isolate provides.
that's right, or the Italian isolate,
Or the Italian isolate that has
right,
the D614G
yeah,
mutation, right?
that's right. So you want
Okay.
to, the way I think about vaccines is, unfortunately, we need to make vaccines against every major mutation
Hmm,
that's caused a problem in a country.
got it.
Clearly, the South African isolates caused a problem in that country.
Right.
The UK isolate, both of them now, have caused a problem in that country. The Brazilian isolate has been devastated in Brazil. And the Cal 20C isolate has caused tremendous problems in Southern California
Right.
and in
Right.
California in general. So
So we
I
need
think,
vaccine makers to really kind of think on their feet and adjust quickly to
well,
these new
yeah,
variants.
I think we have to make vaccines for all major mutations and deletions.
Okay.
And we have to be able to make them quickly, and the approval process has to change significantly. In other words, we've had, if you count the Cal C variant, we've had 4 major mutations
Uh,
that we think affect both infectivity and probably lethality. We'll know for sure soon about infectivity and lethality with the Brazilian and the South African isolates, but as they
okay.
spread. But we've had 4 major mutations in less than 6 months.
I see.
And I would predict, based on the peptide sequences that I look at frequently, that we're not even close to through.
Okay. Okay. So we should expect more changes in the future. Okay. Before we wrap up, let's just get to some recommendations for you about, how should the United States and how should individuals respond based on what we know now about the B.1.1.7 variant. So the first recommendation you have is about masking, right?
Yes, and I've always thought we should wear a mask. We don't have enough N95 rated masks. I still think those are the best masks to wear. They're sometimes uncomfortable to wear and difficult for some people to breathe through. Another solution, if you can't get an N95 rated mask that fits well, would be to double mask. In other words, wear a surgical mask
Mm-hmm.
like I have here,
Mm-hmm.
and then wear another mask over the top of that, okay? In this case, I've got a pseudo N95 rated mask I could wear over it.
Okay,
But
like a
mo-
KN95 that could work too.
right, but most people have cloth masks already.
Right, right.
So
So if I
they could
have
wear,
like my surgical mask or my KN95, right, I can get that, and then I can get my cloth mask as well, and put,
right,
layer
and
those,
I
put one
think
on
the
top
Beth,
of the
yeah,
other.
and
Like
I think the Beth Closs mask would have 2 or 3 layers.
yeah, yeah. A lot of the cloth masks I've seen, you can also purchase a filter that goes inside as well, which I like having that added layer of protection. Okay, so you'd recommend that for folks. Um,
And
what
I
what are
think,
some recommendations that you have about gatherings?
well, I still think because we don't have adequate air handling in any building I've been in recently, and particularly in our cities, our school systems, the buildings people work in.
Hmm.
Most of those buildings, including on one end, are old and they have inadequate ventilation.
Hmm.
And the only solution to that, I see, if you can't improve ventilation, is you have to have these portable air handling equipment that actually filters out viruses and bacteria.
Hmm.
And in our clinic, we've gone ahead and put one in every room. Um,
Great.
so I think that's a possible solution. I think personally it's a good idea to have them at home because there's a lot of transmission inside of homes. Asymptomatic children may be infecting adults or adults infecting children.
Okay,
We
so
have a
getting some
patient,
added HEPA filtration is a good idea anywhere where you're going to be with other people indoors who may have
right?
had some exposure.
As an example for schools, some of our oldest buildings are schools that were improperly ventilated. Frequently, those are closed. You can't open the windows. So
Right.
there's no chance in a schoolroom to have adequate ventilation. And so I think the only solution there for teachers is to have some, to actually buy some equipment and put that in their own room if the school won't provide it.
Okay. So as a last resort, it's probably maybe safer for school buildings to remain closed, right? But for school buildings that are open or opening up in the near future, as a safety precaution, it's a good idea for schools, districts, or individual teachers, as the case may be, to invest in those HEPA filtration systems, those air purifiers, and so on. Okay. Talk to us a little bit about travel and then also recommendations for vaccines. If you
Right.
had a patient who needed to travel for work, what would be your advice for them?
Well, besides mask, there was one other thing I wanted to mention. I
Mhm.
think eye protection is important. Now, people that wear glasses like you and I do
Yeah.
may not be able to wear a pair of goggles or safety glasses over their glasses. I can't. But
Right.
if you wear safety glasses, I think that will protect your eyes better.
Because
Okay.
we know that people can be infected through their eyes, and that's an
That is
often
correct.
overlooked mode of transmission.
That's right. And so I think that eye protection, particularly when you go to the store
Hmm.
or you have to be in some place where there are other people. Like if you absolutely had to fly somewhere or travel on a bus or a train,
Then get the goggles.
then have some goggles, okay?
Got it.
And then so besides masks, goggles, I think we should not forget about good personal hygiene, particularly hand washing with warm, not cold water and with soap. I
So
don't think
schools and businesses that are setting up hand washing stations and reopening buildings, would you say it's really important for them to have warm water for hand washing?
absolutely
Okay.
it should not be hot water, but
Okay.
warm water and soap and
Okay.
do a
I don't
better.
know that I've ever worked in a school where the water in the tap gets warm. I think that would be a particular challenge for school districts. They may just say use Purell instead. I don't know how use hand
Well,
sanitizer instead. I don't know how the effectiveness of that compares, but
I think a cheaper solution than Purell, as an example,
uh-huh.
or any alcohol-based gel, is just a squirt bottle that contains 70% isopropyl alcohol.
Okay. So
And that's
teachers
some
going back to school buildings, people going back to work, isopropyl alcohol is probably your friend
right. And
uh,
you
for
you can buy
sanitizing and
a
such.
standard squirt bottle, 1 liter squirt bottle, and actually usually screw that into a 17% isopropyl alcohol bottle.
Got it.
And that's better for your hands. Alcohol, whether it be in the form of a gel or a spray like I'm talking about, is going to cause some skin damage.
Right.
Okay.
Some
And so I
drying.
think it's also a good idea to have a moisturizing conditioning cream that you
Got it.
can use on your hands.
Sounds good.
And then
Okay.
fruit,
Think
but
I've got one of those.
yeah. So I think those are some keys. You want to keep your skin in good condition as possible. And
Okay.
all of these things I'm talking about to kill viruses, whether it be soap and water or alcohol based or isopropyl alcohol based materials, those things are going to be hard on your hands.
Right.
And
Okay. Before we wrap up, let's talk a little bit because we did mention how, some of the vaccines might not be as effective against the B.1.1.7 variant and other variants. Should people still get their first generation vaccine and why?
yes, absolutely you should, because those isolates are still circulating and infecting people and killing people. And it doesn't matter which country you're in. Those isolates are gradually being replaced by mutations, like in California, the 20 Cal C variant. That doesn't mean you don't get the vaccine. And
Okay.
it may be that some of the other antibodies that are generated based on other parts of the spike protein might be of some benefit.
Got it.
So everyone should get that. And the way you should think of these new vaccines that'll be coming out, those are really kind of like booster vaccines for people that had the infection but didn't get vaccinated, and for people that had the original vaccines. Let's just call those the first generation vaccines. Those are
Mm,
all the vaccines that are approved or awaiting approval. These new
okay.
vaccines, I don't think will be ready for 3 to 6 months, just depending upon how regulatory authorities approach this.
Oh, so
And
definitely
just,
don't wait for that. Yeah.
yeah, but more importantly, I want to say that those regulatory authorities should allow us to use a surrogate marker for protection.
Okay.
And the simplest thing would be generating antibody, the receptor binding domain. Those reagents, clone receptor binding domain proteins, are readily available even to our rural clinic. And I think that they ought to accept a surrogate marker for approval of vaccines, not just booster vaccines, but for all vaccines. We know that antibody receptor binding domain is protective. That's
Mm,
where the neutralizing epitopes are. So until we have uh, loop sequence specific peptide antigens,
mm.
there's a 28 amino acid sequence where all the neutralizing antibodies are directed. Until we have those reagents available to detect antibodies, I think we have to use the whole receptor binding domain or a smaller piece called the receptor binding motif.
Okay, so we may
And
we may need to adjust how the vaccines are designed in order to make them a little more effective and in order to figure out what kind of antibody response they help folks generate.
and
Um,
I think the regulatory authorities have to start thinking more about uh, surrogate markers for approval for vaccines.
got it. Okay, well, we're almost out of time, but The last thing I know, we had talked about this this morning. We saw that this study had just been released about the headline is teachers can play a substantial role in school SARS-CoV-2 transmission. And while we're not going to get into all the details of this today, so this showed up in our inboxes. It comes from Journal Watch. They did a little summary of this. But the actual article is from the CDC's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. We'll revisit this in a later episode, but we just wanted to make our audience aware of this. That this might be something you want to check out. I can see 184 news outlets have already picked it up, so you'll probably be hearing about it at some point this week. But keeping in mind that the conclusion of this is that SARS-CoV-2 COVID-19 transmission is happening in schools like this schools in this district in Georgia that the CDC studied in December and January. Do you have any final words, Dr. Wright, about just opening as districts plan to open school buildings over the next month or so? Is there anything, any takeaways that you have just from looking at that research?
Yeah, absolutely. I think teachers need to be vaccinated. And I think all the employees that work in the school need to be vaccinated. This study suggests, although it doesn't prove, that at least in these clusters, teachers were able to infect students and other teachers, and the infection were then transmitted to other people. For instance, this teacher here in F, she infected one other teacher,
right,
who infected one other student, and each of those people infected someone that was not in the school.
Right. So here in this diagram, the triangles represent educators, and then the circles represent students. The diamonds represent students' family members or teachers' family members. And so you can see sometimes it's not clear who infected whom, right? So like here, you don't know whether it was the teacher who brought the infection into the school or the student, but you know that 2 other students were subsequently infected and then infected one of their family members, right?
But the F was what I was talking about down here.
Yeah, no, the F, well, yeah, but what I was saying is in some cases you don't know who the initial case was, right? Whether
that's correct.
The student, right? In this one, they're pretty sure it was the teacher, which suggests that, yeah, you want teachers vaccinated, right?
Yeah, and here's the very interesting one is I in the middle.
Right.
Where you say that one teacher infected another, 2 other teachers.
Right.
Or excuse me, one other teacher, and that teacher infected multiple students, another teacher, and 3 family members were infected by the students.
Right.
And so
I would say this is probably, they need to close the faculty lounge, or they need to pay more attention to transmission in the restrooms, right? Because how do you get this large, you've got 4 or 5 teachers all infected, so they must have been in the same indoor space at some point, right?
Right, and of course they are, and they have a shared bathroom in the teachers. You know that in the teachers' lounge. But the key thing is, everyone needs to mask, and you need to do these other things, but that won't be enough, which they say in this article.
Right. And we know kids are not always very good at masking effectively, right? Those masks, they're not made for their little faces, number one, right? And those masks often slip off the noses, and kids make lots of mistakes and test rules and so on. And so, even when the consequences are deadly, kids are still gonna test rules. We know this,
but
especially teenagers tend to seek risk, right?
Yeah, but this article is a classic example of why we have to vaccinate people in schools. We have to treat the school system just like we've treated the hospitals, where we've vaccinated everyone in the hospital. And in our clinic, we've vaccinated now everyone in our clinic.
Right. Everyone who's going to have contact with the public, you need to be vaccinated or you're going to have
That's correct.
more virus circulating.
And the fact that teachers will be spending, I know you have 150 students.
Yeah.
You'll be spending 8 hours a day in contact with 150 high schoolers.
Right. And presumably very few of them will be vaccinated because most of them are too young to be vaccinated. So that's the other concern that I would have for them. But we really would like to revisit this more in a later episode. But for today, we're going to wrap up our episode of Close Reading B.1.1.7. If you are interested in exploring more reflections and data analysis from Dr. Wright, Dr. Wright does have a blog that he keeps at davidcwrightmd.com/news. Feel free to stop by there periodically. He posts a data analysis update every 2 weeks, his 14-day update looking more closely at some of the COVID-19 data. And also, if you have a question that you'd like us to tackle in a future episode of Close Reading COVID-19, please tweet your questions to Dr. Wright at DCWrightMD on Twitter. And we also want to extend a special thanks today to Michael Bowe and Ann Wright for all the assistance they provided us in producing this podcast. This presentation template is from SlidesGo. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Stay safe. Don't forget to wear your mask, and we will see you next time.
What good is sunshine when you are blue? When there is no one who cares for you? The birds are singing songs by the score, but you just wonder who they're singing for. What good is moonlight when you're alone and everybody else is gay? No one to talk to on the telephone. No wonder I feel this way. I've got the blues, but I'm just too mean to cry. All through the day, I just worry and I sigh. Oh, poor little me, how I long to see some sweet papa bouncing on my knee. Oh, what's the use? They all go and pass me by. If any longer I must pine, I'll swallow down a quarter's worth of iodine. 'Cause I've got the blues, but I'm just too mean to cry. All by my own some day after day. I get so lonesome living that way. Somebody, sweetie, I'm gonna steal, because I've never had a real square deal. Most every evening I go to bed and dream of someone all night through. I should be at some sweetie's home instead, but tell me, what can I do? I've got the blues.